Hello, everyone, and welcome to another CKS webinar, one of the many programs and activities and events hosted and produced by the Center for Khmer Studies, as the center supports research and scholarship in the arts and humanities dealing with Cambodia and the greater Mekong region. I just want to say these are uncertain times, as we all know. And I think on behalf of CKS, I'd like to thank everyone who's continued to support CKS financially and in kind during these really uncertain financial and other uncertainties that exist now in the world that make programs like CKS more challenging. But as you can see, the CKS leadership has done an amazing job in adjusting to these uncertainties and making sure that its mission continues and the important work that it does continues. So that said, I would like to now introduce Dr. Zava and just say a few words. The title of her presentation today is Clothing as Coding: New Approaches to Reading the Costume, Narrative Logic, and Iconography of Baphuon Temple. Dr. Zava is a historian and museum professional specializing in the Angkorian iconography and costume studies. She received her PhD from the University of Pécs in Hungary, where she focused on carved costume depictions at Bantiesrai Temple. She's taught courses on Southeast Asian art, and she's previously worked as a curator of Southeast Asian museum collections in Budapest, and is currently an independent researcher living in Georgia in the United States. And I look forward to welcoming her and beginning her presentation, but I will just say a couple of words about Dr. Zava's research methodology, which is so interesting. She looks at both the iconography of the temple, that means what the figures in the bas-reliefs mean, who they are, what they are, answering the question of what, but very interestingly, also their iconology, how they mean, and doing this in a very contextualized way, comparing it to literary texts and the social and historical and economic conditions at the time of their making, to get a better and deeper understanding of how these figures presented in the bas-reliefs relate to each other through motifs and different configurations, and how they can perhaps give us a greater and deeper understanding of some of the philosophical and religious and ontological thinking at that time. So that said, it is my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Barbara Zava to the CKS webinar today. Welcome, Dr. Zava, and take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And good evening for those who are in the United States at this moment. Thank you very much, Professor Chigas, for taking your time to moderate this lecture, and also for your kind support and great introduction as well. I would like to also express my gratitude to the Center for Khmer Studies for this opportunity, for the fellowship I got from them, and for the constant support I got from you while I was in Cambodia and since. It is a great feeling and great pleasure to belong to the CKS team a little bit. Today, as Professor Chiga's introduction already explained, I try to present you my recent research, which I conducted last year for 4 months in Baphuon, in Cambodia. The Baphuon temple, constructed in the mid-11th century during the reign of Udayaditya Varman II, occupies a pivotal position in the development of Angkorian art. while its architectural significance has long been recognized, its narrative reliefs remain comparatively understudied, largely due to their fragmentary condition and the absence of continuous narrative galleries. The troubled history of the building's restoration, already presented by Professor Csigász, also prevented predecessors from conducting more detailed iconographic research. Any analysis of Baphuon reliefs must consider the fundamentally incomplete state of the monument. Despite extensive restoration efforts, the temple has not been reconstructed in all details. Numerous sculptural fragments, including decorated narrative panels, remain scattered on the ground around the pyramid or have been lost entirely. And in many cases, their original architectural position cannot be determined with certainty. I have attempted to document and incorporate these displayed elements into my present study, occasionally under less than ideal field conditions, thanks to the monkeys, but the absence of secure contextual information inevitably limits their interpretive value. A Hindu temple cannot be understood only through its architectural form or decorative program. Its design was shaped by prescriptive religious texts, regional cultural conventions, established artistic precedents, and the political, economic, and personal interest of the patron. Although the exact textual sources underlying the design of Baphuon remain unknown, its spatial organization and architectural proportions clearly follow classical Indian models. Previous scholarship has suggested that these rule books, such as the Manasara, as well as the great Hindu epics, were likely known at the Angkorian court in the 11th century. While many figures have already been identified on this basis, significant potential remains for further clarification. The objective of this research is to conduct a comparative iconographic analysis of the clothing, jewelry, and hairstyles worn by the figures depicted in the bas-reliefs and sculptural program of Baphuon. By identifying and cataloging recurring motifs in attire and adornment, the study enables systematic comparison of costume types, both in isolation and within narrative compositions. This approach allows us to examine the functional role of attire as a hierarchical marker within the mythological system. In practice, these details serve as a code to more precisely identify specific characters where other features and attributes may be missing or eroded. Therefore, the central question guiding this research is, can dress function as a visual code that helps identify figures and better understand narrative reliefs in Baphuon? To address this, I will structure my talk to 5 parts. I will start to present you the Baphuon database I built and the methodology. Then briefly, I will talk briefly about the narrative reliefs in Angkor, with a focus on Baphuon, of course, and also about the question of the iconographic program of Baphuon. Then I'd like to present you the costume and adornment notes in the Baphuon style. And finally, I'd like to show you a case study how I try to identify the Krishna figures in Baphuon and coeval monuments. During my fieldwork in 2025, I systematically documented all visible human figures at Baphuon, resulting in a corpus of 818 entries so far. Each figure was recorded through photography, of course, detailed written description, and a categorical classification. I organized the information into categories: costume types, headdresses, hairstyles, jewelry types, of course, the narrative context, and the position within the figure's position within the composition. And I added, of course, the corresponding FAO archival photos and all the other related references. This structure enables both qualitative comparison and quantitative analysis at this moment. The database is maintained in Excel format, but the next phase will involve converting the spreadsheet format into a more interactive digital platform in which each record appears as an illustrated descriptive card, just like the one I try to present here. The project combines three approaches. First, a systematic iconographic identification. That's the basis. Each figure is analyzed based on costume, hairstyle, jewelry, and position within the composition, as I already mentioned. Then comes, or with it comes, comparative analysis. When I compare the Baphuon material with approximately coeval monuments, such as Banteisrei, or the other monuments I listed here, Phnom Chisor, Pivir, Pimai, and some others. Then comes a spatial contextualization. Since Baphuon lacks continuous narrative galleries, the placement of reliefs within the architecture becomes a key interpretive tool. The goal is not to reconstruct a definitive narrative program, but to establish probabilities and patterns. The term narrative relief is widely used in the study of Angkorian art to describe compositions that allow the viewer to read a story visually. In Hindu art, such imaginary functions not merely as an illustration, but as means of establishing a ritual connection between devotee and deities. As Archana Verma once noted, the purpose of the visual narratives was primarily to communicate the qualities of the enshrined deity through myth narration in visual form. In the 10th century, Banteisrei, one of the earliest experiments with narrative compression, can be observed. Multiple moments of a story are condensed into a single sculptural scene. In contrast, Baphuon represents a shift towards narrative articulation. Here, episodes are distributed across multiple panels, organized in vertical and horizontal sequences. Narrative meaning emerges through spatial progression, both through vertical reading within the panel groups and through horizontal relationships across the registers. The interpretation of the Baphuon reliefs is closely tied to the question of ritual circumambulation. Although the temple, as a Shaiva monument, would traditionally accommodate clockwise pradakshina, ritual movement, the organization of its reliefs does not consistently align with such a path. Early scholarship already recognized the complexity of this system. Georges Sedes observed that the arrangement of scenes does not correspond to either clockwise pradakshina or counterclockwise prasavya, circumambulation, suggesting a decorative logic instead. Rather than indicating disorder, this insight points to a more sophisticated visual organization in which episodes are grouped thematically rather than arranged in strict linear sequence. Maurice Glaise further proposed that many reliefs are best understood when read vertically, from bottom to top, forming coherent narrative units. Bernard-Philippe Grolier later identified the Baphuon as transitional monument in which narrative reliefs begin to function as extended cycles rather than isolated scenes, anticipating the fully developed programs in Angkor Wat. More recent approaches have moved away from the research for a single reading order, emphasizing instead the coexistence of multiple modes of engagement: ritual, spatial, and narrative. In this respect, the work of Pascal Royer is particularly relevant, as it highlights the importance of architectural context, and spatial sequencing in the interpretation of Angkorian monuments. The reliefs of the exterior faces of the gopuras, the gate towers, further reinforce this interpretation. Positioned on the outside walls of the gate buildings, they confront the viewer frontally and are intended to be encountered from multiple directions. These images function as emblematic statements, activating mythological memory. The absence of a continuous narrative cycle raises the question of whether Baphuon possesses a coherent iconographic program. The answer is not straightforward. While it may not be possible to reconstruct the unified sequence, recurring themes and compositional structures suggest an underlying logic. A temple mountain dedicated to Shiva, the Baphuon, articulates the cosmological symbolism of Mount Meru. The monument is oriented to the east and organized along a longitudinal axis, extending from an elevated causeway to the central sanctuary. The temple itself is enclosed within a series of concentric galleries and walls, forming a hierarchical sequence of secret spaces. These enclosures have gopuras, gate towers, at the cardinal points, which function as transitional threshold and as a primary loci for sculptural decoration. The temple mountain is composed of 3 superimposed terraces arranged in a pyramidal configuration. Continuous vaulted galleries, accessible through the axial gopuras, structure circulation within the monument. Subsequent modifications, as it was mentioned already, notably the addition of the monumental reclining Buddha on the western facade, have significantly altered the original configuration, yet the underlying architectural logic remains legible. The sculptural program of the gopuras reveals a complex and non-uniform distribution of narrative themes, suggesting that iconographic content was organized in relation to both spatial hierarchy and directorial orientation. At the outermost eastern gopura, in the 4th enclosure, only Devata figures have been preserved. Unfortunately, no narrative panels survived. By contrast, the western gopura preserved fragmentary narrative panels, including episodes from both the Ramayana, most notably Sita in captivity, and the life of Krishna. Within the same enclosure, the so-called cruciform pavilion presents different thematic emphasis. The surviving panels, though incomplete, appear to be dominated by Shaiva narratives, including multiple episodes of Arjuna Kirata. At the same time, the presence of Sita's captivity scene demonstrates again that even within the predominantly Shaiva context, a Vaishnava narrative repertoire is presented too. The gopuras of the 3rd enclosure are too damaged to allow for secure identification of narrative cycles. However, their lintels and pediments consistently depict Vaishnava themes, particularly episodes related to Krishna and Vamana. The 2nd enclosure provides the most extensive and best preserved evidence for thematic organization. On the eastern gopura, the external southern side is dominated by Shaiva narratives, including Arjuna Kirata, the marriage of Shiva and Parvati, the destruction of Kama. Proceeding in a clockwise productional direction, the internal southern side shifts towards Vaishnava themes with episodes from the lives of Krishna, Parashurama, and Rama, alongside the story of Tilottama from the Mahabharata. The internal northern side presents Ramayana scenes, including the Battle of Lanka and the death of Tataka, while the external northern side returns to the Mahabharata, depicting the dice game of Yudhishthira, the humiliation of Draupadi, and the Kurukshetra battle. The southern Gopura is similarly complex. Its external eastern side is dominated by Mahabharata scenes, including the Kurukshetra battle, the death of Jayadratha, the duel between Bhima and Duryodhana. The external western side shifts to episodes from Krishna's childhood and youth, again accompanied by the Tilottama scene. The internal western side remains difficult to interpret due to preservation issues and due to inconsistencies in the depiction of recognizable clothing, though it likely depicts multiple avatars of Vishnu, including Krishna, Rama, and maybe Narasimha. The internal eastern side presents Ramayana scenes, especially episodes from the Battle of Lanka, alongside the story of Vamana and Bali. The western Gopura of the second enclosure is dominated on its external southern side by Mahabharata narratives. Then the external northern side likely continues the thematic emphasis with episodes involving Arjuna, Krishna, and Bhima. Internally, the northern side presents Mahabharata and Ramayana material, but the southern internal side is clearly devoted to the Ramayana, depicting Kumbhakarna's battle and death, and the episode of Marika as the golden deer. And finally, the northern Gopura presents the most coherent thematic program. Both its external and internal faces are almost exclusively devoted to the Ramayana. Scenes include the duel of Valin and Sugriva, the exploits of Hanuman, the battle of Lanka, the meeting of Rama and Lakshmana with Hanuman, and the death of Indrajit. The recurring depiction of Sita in captivity further reinforces the focus. In contrast to the other Gopuras, the northern gate tower thus appears to be systematically organized around a single epic cycle. The depictions of the eastern Gopura of the uttermost, the first enclosure, are very difficult to see. Apart from one or two figures of Krishna, no other narrative theme has been identified so far. So, taken together, these observations demonstrate that the sculptural program of the Baphuon Gopuras is neither random nor fully systematically in a linear sense. A clear coexistence of Shaiva and Vaishnava material can be observed, with Shaiva themes often concentrated in specific locations, while Vaishnava narratives are more widely distributed. At the same time, the distribution of themes is not uniform at all. Certain episodes recur with notable frequency, such as the Arjuna Kirata, Sita in captivity, the duel between Valin and Sugriva, or the story of Tilottama and the various combat scenes of Krishna. A further level of organization becomes apparent at the scale of individual architectural surface. The exterior and interior faces of the Gopuras appear to be devoted to one or at most two dominant thematic groups. In most cases, it is possible to identify a relative coherence in the distribution of Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Krishna-related scenes. This suggests that the narrative content was structured in relation to directionality, movement, and the viewer's progression through space. This organization remains only partially legible. The fragmentary condition of the reliefs and the uncertainty of all iconographic identification limit the reconstruction of fully coherent program at this moment. But within this framework, the variability and distribution of costume gain further significance, as it provides one of the most consistent means of navigating this complexity. So, let me now turn to one of the central aspects of my research, the analysis of costume and the adornment in the Baphuon style. The analysis of costume builds on the foundational work of Jean Boisselier, who identified the Baphuon style as a moment of increasing formal clarity and linear stylization within Khmer art, particularly in the treatment of dress. In his fundamental work, La statuaire khmer et son évolution in 1955. The principal garment depicted on the reliefs is the sampot. In the Baphuon style, this garment is rendered as a close-fitting cloth that follows the contours of the hips, rises sharply along the lateral edges and leaves the abdomen exposed in a very characteristic indented form. The garment is fixed at the waist by a visible knot, often accompanied by ribbons or bow-like extensions that may hang either at the front or at the back. The fabric is pleated, and the sculptures treated in a highly controlled, almost graphic manner, rather than suggesting soft textile drapery. The folds are stylized, linear, and rhythmic. It is important to emphasize, however, that this formalization does not imply a departure from contemporary modes of dress. Rather, it reflects the conventions of sculptural representation through which actual garments are translated into a coherent visual style. I define this style as the Baphuon style sampot chongban to distinguish it from what may be termed the traditional sampot chongban. The distinction is not merely formal, but also functional. The Baphuon style variant first appears in Bante Srai, where it is worn by warriors, youthful deities, and certain demons, approximately 32% of the male representations. Its distribution suggests that it signifies a narrative role rather than a fixed rank. By contrast, the traditional sampot chongban is made from fully pleated textile and features a broad semicircular fold at the front above the belt. This type is worn approximately 60% of the male figures at Bante Srai and dominates the major pediments and lintels. It is consistently associated with high-ranking figures, kings, principal gods, and major mythological characters. So what do we know about these in Baphuon? Based on the current state of my Baphuon database, which includes 818 entries, it is possible to draw some preliminary quantitative conclusions. In terms of gender distribution, the corpus is strongly dominated by male figures. As you can see, 71% of the figures are men. I have to note that I classify as a male figure any figure that wears male clothing, mythological animals, or Garuda or the Vanaras. So everyone who is wearing a male clothing. When we examine sampot types, clear patterns emerge. In the case of the male sampot types, the most dominant type is what I classify as Baphuon style sampot chongban. 62% of all the male clothing is Baphuon style sampot chongban. Oh, sorry. Among female figures, the distribution is far more homogeneous. Approximately 90% were a standard Baphuon style sampot. Pleated variants and other minor types appear only sporadically, each representing 1 to 3% of the corpus. As for the hairstyles and hairdresses, there is also a strong differentiation. In the case of the male figures, as you can see in these numbers, 64% of the males wear diadem, and the crown, which is called, this type of crown is called Karanda Mukuta. 46%, I think I said 64, but it's 46%. But if you see the next two numbers, when the hair is simply tied in a knot or tied in a chignon, those two numbers altogether equals more than 46%. So a dominant number in the male hairstyle, in the case of the male hairstyle, is simply arranged hairstyle. As for the females, the situation is the same. The hair simply tied in a knot in 65% of the cases, and only 35% of the female figures were diadem and crown, karanda mukuta. So what do these data shows? A comparison between Bhante Sray and Baphuon reveals a striking inversion in the distribution of costume types and their relationship to narrative representation. At Bhante Sray, the traditional Sampot Chongban, often combined with the diadem and the mukuta, predominates. At Baphuon, this configuration is notably less frequent, giving way instead to a wider range of less formalized garments. My previous research in Bhante Sray has demonstrated that variations in Sampot type within narrative reliefs play a decisive role in conveying the hierarchical and narrative status of individual figures. Differences in dress are not merely stylistic, but function as a visual language through which rank, identity, and narrative role are articulated. When the same question is applied to the reliefs of Baphuon, the statistical divergence becomes noticeable. The relative scarcity of high-status costume types, such as traditional Sampot Chongban, reflects a fundamental shift in the composition of the figural corpus. Unlike Bhante Sray, where representations of major deities and elevated mythological protagonists dominate, Baphuon presents a broader spectrum of figures, many of whom occupy lower positions within the mythological hierarchy or lower position in that particular scene. This shift is evident in the comparatively high frequency of loincloth type garments, as what you can see in this panel, for example. Their occurrence can be directly related to the Shaiva character of the monument. Ascetic figures, both in narrative scenes and in decorative contexts such as frieze and column bases, are abundantly represented. In this context, the loincloth functions as an attribute of ascetic identity. Significantly, Shiva himself frequently appears in the guise of Kirata, like in this panel, a hunter, and in this form, he likewise wears a loincloth, reinforcing the association between this garment type and specific theological and narrative roles. At the same time, the continuity with Bhante Sray can be observed in the consistent association between particular textile patterns and specific categories of figures. One notable example is the checkered textile Sampot, which appears as a stable iconographic marker of demonic beings, the Rakshasas. At Bhante Sray, this garment is worn by Ravana, while at Baphuon, it is associated with a lot of demons in the Battle of Lanka, such as Kumbhakarna or even the guards, the female guards of Sita. The persistence of this visual convention across monuments suggests the existence of a shared and recognizable iconographic code in which textile patterning contributes to the immediate identification of the character type. Let me also show an example of how the differentiation of the Sampot types helps to identify characters and thus define the themes of the panels more precisely. A panel on the northern Gopura of the second enclosure shows a battle scene, which is believed to depict a duel between Rama and Ravana during the Battle of Lanka. The panel shows 6 male figures. Behind the chariot stands Lakshmana and Vibhishana. Hanuman flies in the sky holding a rock. Rama shoots arrows while standing on the chariot, and one man is laying on the ground, probably dead. All of the listed characters appear in Baphuon style Sampot Chongban, except for the 6th character, the charioteer. He wears the traditional Sampot Chongban of the highest rank. I believe that the explanation for this depiction, which at first glance seems contradictory, is that he is the highest ranking character in the given scene, as he is none other than Matali, Indra's divine charioteer. He was sent by Indra to help Rama on the last day of the battle. Therefore, identifying the charioteer as the god Matali, it made it clear to me that this is the depiction of the final battle that decides the fate of the war. Lakshmana is you can recognize Lakshmana by his hair twisted into a bun on this panel. This simple hairstyle refers to his subordinate role in the story compared to Rama, his brother. If we analyze his appearances, not only in Baphuon, but also in the reliefs of Bante's Rai, for example, we can see that he always stands behind his brother, often depicted in slightly smaller size. When their roles in the story are the same, so is their appearance. However, when Lakshmana's role is not emphasized according to the story, it is visible in the difference in their clothing or hairstyle. For example, in the panel on the same Gopura, the inner east side of the northern Gopura, when they meet Hanuman, Rama, who is touching Hanuman's shoulder, appears in a traditional sampot, while his younger brother, standing behind him, is in a Baphuon style Chongkaban. The variety of Rama's attire on the same building is a perfect way to show his changing status in the story. When he is depicted alongside Matali, the costume emphasizes his role as a warrior who, at that particular moment, accepts a lower rank in order to receive divine assistance. However, when he meets Hanuman, his attire becomes much more dignified, indicating him as the highest ranking character in the scene. These different attires are not a mistake. They are visual shortcuts and show the viewer exactly who Rama is and how much power he has at different points in his journey. Let me show you now a few points about the identification of Krishna. The figure of Krishna provides a suitable case study for demonstrating the analytical potential of the costume database. At Baphuon, Krishna appears in multiple narrative contexts, including scenes of combat, divine intervention, and royal confrontation. At the same time, many depictions are damaged or lack clear attributes, making identification uncertain. For this reason, the analysis cannot be limited to the Baphuon material alone. Rather, Krishna's costume, hairstyle, and jewelry must be we have to examine the costume, the hairstyle, and jewelry comparatively, both in relation to earlier representations at Bante's Rai and to coeval depictions at other Angkorian monuments. Among these elements, earrings and hairstyles are of primary diagnostic value for me. Let's see the earrings. In Angkorian art, most figures, especially deities, were lotus bud-shaped earrings. Archaeological finds, such as the gold examples discovered at 𝐀𝐭 and recently repatriated to the National Museum in 𝐀𝐭, confirm that the conical forms correspond to actual jewelry types typically associated with divine or royal status. By contrast, the hook-shaped earrings, originated from the Javanese Patrakundala, are characteristic of demonic beings and have functioned as such since at least the 9th century in the Angkorian art. The presence of these two types significantly facilitates the differentiation of the figures. For instance, for my identification of the demon Putana in a Baphuon panel is supported by the presence of hook-shaped earrings. A third major type is the disc-shaped earring, one of the earliest attested forms in Southeast Asia, already present in pre-Angkorian sculpture. For example, a relic from Funan, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Unlike the lotus bud type, disc-shaped earrings are generally not associated with the highest ranking deities. Instead, they tend to appear on secondary figures, attendants, or characters of lower hierarchical status. At Baphuon, they are particularly frequent among ordinary characters and, for example, the Vanarans. Importantly, however, from the Bantesrai period onward, Krishna and Balarama are usually depicted wearing plain disc-shaped earrings, like on this beautiful pediment, which depicts the Krishna is mounting lifting the Mount Govardhana, now in the Battambang Museum. If we continue with the hairstyles and hairdresses, we can see that Krishna and Balarama typically wear their hair tied in a simple knot or ponytail in accordance with Indian prescriptions for youthful deities. When combined with the Baphuon style Sampot Chonkoban and disc-shaped earrings, this appearance emphasized their role as young heroes. The triple knot hairstyle is comparatively rare, but I believe that highly significant. Its occurrence is largely restricted to scenes involving the child or young Krishna. On the second Gopura, the southwest outer wall, on the third panel, you can see this narrative panel. This is the most frequently depicted scene from the Krishna cycle when Krishna is subduing Kaliya Naga. Krishna wears a Baphuon-style sampot with his hair tied in 3 knots. This hairstyle is characteristic of young boys in Hindu iconography, especially young boys. Konakondli Krishnamurti's analysis of hairstyles seen on the walls of the Gandhara Hindu temples is noteworthy, even though they date from a much earlier period, the 3rd century. He notes that on the sculptures, the children appear with either cropped hair or 2 or 3 tufts tied into a chignon. This hairstyle appears again in panel 4 at the same wall, and also at Wat Phu, nowadays Laos. It is also seen on a lintel from Prasat Panchun, now in the National Museum in Phnom Penh, and also in a pediment in nowadays Thailand in Phnom Rung. Also, the same episode, Krishna is lifting the Mount Govardhana. That same Kaliya Naga episode on other sites, for example, at Muang Tham or at Previer, is a little bit different. Krishna is shown with a single knot, but with the same Baphuon style Chonkaban and disc-shaped earrings. If we take a look at that other already mentioned scene, lifting of Mount Govardhana, this episode appears in at least 7, if not more, locations at Baphuon. Some of them are very eroded, but I think I can differentiate 7 locations. This theme was a favorite in the 10th and 11th century in Khmer art. You can find it in this is the one from the Battambang Provincial Museum. This is from Phnom Baset originally. But you find it also in Bantesrai on one of the pediments. You can find it in Previer, unfortunately a very eroded and maybe now even more ruined condition. And even in Pimai, you can see that he's always wearing the same Baphuon style Sampot Chonkoban, and his hair is always the same, one knot at the top. Let's jump to another episode of Krishna's life, if this is really Krishna's life episode. I just check the time. Oh, okay. I'm almost at the end. A recurring but textually unattested motif in Khmer art depicts a heroic figure simultaneously combating a lion and an elephant. The absence of a clear literary parallel has led to uncertainty in identifying this figure. However, a systematic analysis of hairstyle and earring typologies allows for a more secure attribution. This is in Bhante Shrey. Sadly, the head has been broken off, so I had to rely on the photographs taken by Golubev in 1926. The figure is characterized by disc-shaped earrings, a distinctive neck ornament, and his hair is gathered into one knot. I think he is Krishna, and it is because of the costume characteristic mentioned before. At Baphuon, on the eastern lintel of the main tower, on the third eastern Gopura, a figure is depicted slaying both a lion and an elephant. His sampot is not clearly visible, only a long frontal sash is visible, but his hair is gathered into a single top knot with the remaining length arranged in a ponytail, in actually two ponytails that curve symmetrically or to either side, just like on the other Krishna depiction in Baphuon. Further representations of the lion and elephant combat are known from the Battambang Provincial Museum. Unfortunately, the origin is unknown. And again, one pediment in Preville. Although these examples are very eroded, their compositional similarity suggests participation in the same iconographic type. Once the Bhante Shrey figure is securely identified, these parallels can reasonably be interpreted as further depictions of Krishna. And finally, let me mention that the presence of the diadem and the Karanda Mukuta in Krishna depictions in Baphuon marks a significant shift in his visual characterization, distributing a specific subset of representation that differ fundamentally from the more frequent young hero type. In these representations, Krishna is consistently depicted with multiple arms, usually 4, divine attributes, and lotus bud-shaped earrings. This is Krishna too here. In these cases, the diadem and mukuta function first and foremost as indicators of Krishna's fully divine status. This pattern, previously observed in Bhante Shrey, is further confirmed my current findings at Baphuon. The scene on the second western Gopura depicts a male figure engaged in a combat with an elephant. Its identification has previously remained uncertain. It has been interpreted either as Krishna's battle with Kuvalayapida, the elephant, or as the killing of the war elephant Ashwathaman by Arjuna during the Kurukshetra war. The figure is shown grasping the elephant by the tail, an unusual and striking motif within Khmer visual narration. He is dressed in traditional style Sampot Chonkoban and adorned with a diadem and a Karanda Mukuta and lotus bud earrings. In light of the criteria established earlier for identifying the young Krishna, it becomes evident for me that this royal attire does not correspond to Krishna, but rather to Arjuna, the central heroic figure of the Kurukshetra war. This case clearly demonstrates the interpretive power of costume coding. Costume and ornamental details are not merely decorative, but function as precise iconographic markers that guide identification even in otherwise uncertain narrative contexts. So, Numerous additional representations of Krishna can be identified at Baphuon, many of which still await precise iconographic interpretation. The observations presented here regarding costume, hairstyle, and jewelry have not yet been consistently verified across all examples, and the analytical process, of course, remains ongoing. Taken together, these observations demonstrate that the identification of Krishna in Khmer narrative reliefs does not always depend on a single defining attribute, but rather on the combined analysis of multiple visual markers. Attire forms an independent system in which each element acquires meaning through its relationship to the others. Within the broader scope of this study, I hope that these findings confirm that costume and jewelry operate as a structured yet adaptable iconographic code capable of delivering identity, status, and narrative function across both individual monuments and the wider Khmer artistic tradition. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Zava. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
First of all, Borbala, I think it's fair to say that you make a very convincing argument that clothing and costuming does indeed provide us with some kind of coding into the identity of the figures and their specific role in a particular scene. There's so much here really in complexity when we think about how using these bas-reliefs and these images that we try to read the monuments and read the bas-reliefs. The attributes that you highlight, the Sompat style, the earring style, and the hairstyle, and how these different attributes define the identity of a particular character, and how that identity can change from scene to scene depending on the particular context that that character is presented. One of the examples that you gave, the fascinating difference between the role of Rama when with the charioteer, where he takes on a lesser role in order to receive the instructions from the divine character in the scene. In that scene, Rama takes on a lesser role in order to receive those instructions. And that lesser role, as you presented so clearly, is defined through the clothing, his Sompat style. And then in the next scene that you presented, where Rama is with Hanuman, the Sompat style bestows upon him, identifies him in a higher hierarchical position. Just to identify those markers is fascinating to me. And as we look at these bas-reliefs, you see that there's so many layers of detail and encoding that takes place to enable the viewer to have a better idea of what is happening in the bas-relief. Within that coding system that you are cataloging through your database. So let me just summarize what I was saying, that the specific coding that you've identified through the Sompat, the hairstyles, and the earring styles, how they specify and detail a particular figure's identity in a particular scene, how that level of reading also transfers over to the intertextual reading that you refer to as you look at similar characters, say Krishna or Rama, in different temples, at different temples, and how the coding there changes and the reading of the character changes. So I guess just in summary, I am fascinated at this methodology and the additional insight that you bring through your cataloging of the different specific codes, hairstyle, sompat style, earring style, to our ability to read these bas-reliefs. And there's so many layers and levels of reading that take place, as you've described. Even just the idea of vertical versus horizontal versus circular. Is it counterclockwise or clockwise that the larger presentation of the different episodes within a single bas-relief adds another level of complexity to the reading. I think it's fair to say that the Angkor temples in the Angkor period is perhaps, the most studied topic of Khmer studies. Of course, there are many, many others, and they each have their importance. But what you've talked about today underlines for me how little we know, despite the extent of the studying that's done, and that we're just beginning to be able to read these bas-reliefs and have different interpretations through these systems of method that you've developed here of encoding and cataloging the different codes through the use of clothing. I guess I would like to pose a question now, after I've tried to, as well as I could, summarize some of the ideas that came to mind for me by listening to your presentation. As we try to read the bas-reliefs and the temples as a whole, the most, I guess, basic reading of the temples is that, for example, Angkor Wat and many of the other temple mountains, present kind of a map of the Hindu cosmology centered around Mount Meru. Now, that's probably the most basic reading of the temples, right? And then when we get to as we focus and zoom in closer and closer, and we get to looking at a single bas-relief, we see how much deeper and richer and multi-layered each temple and each bas-relief is in its reference to literary texts. And you mentioned many times the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the different characters within those texts and how they change. The question I'd like to pose, and I see we do have a few questions on the Q&A, we'll get to those. The question I'd like to pose is if you can just kind of step back and look at Baphuon, and if you were to try to give a general idea of the story that Baphuon tells. I think, for example, of Eleanor Monica's work on Angkor Wat and the studies that she's done on the bas-reliefs of the third gallery, and basically saying how the bas-reliefs, the 8 different panels of the third gallery, try to tell the story of Suryavarman II, his taking of power, his use of power, the churning of the sea of milk, and the role of the king as preserver, as is depicted by Vishnu. This general reading of the third gallery of Angkor Wat kind of gives us, well, one interpretation of the history and the story of Suryavarman himself. If you were to look now on what you've seen so far of Baphuon, would you say that Baphuon tells a particular story, or is there many stories happening at the same time and it's not possible to kind of organize them into a single narrative? I'm just interested on your thoughts on that. And I know that there's no definitive answer, of course. You're reading a complicated text. It's like reading Shakespeare's King Lear and saying, what is the story of King Lear about? What is the story of Baphuon about, in your view, in as much as you can respond to that?
Yes, the answer is no. I cannot respond to that.
Of course.
And if you think about the Lear, Shakespeare's work, why did he choose that topic? That's the main question, and that's what we don't know about any of the Angkorian monuments because of the lack of the written sources, obviously. And as for Angkor Wat, yes, we have this hypothetic image that Suryavarman II really wanted to make an eternal memorial place for himself. And I believe that all of these buildings, and that's why I mentioned the patron, the role of the patron. I was not talking about it in this lecture, of course, because it's unknown. we are not even sure who exactly built or finalized the decoration on Baphuon, because that's very important. One thing is the Temple Mountain. We kind of know why they were built. What was the royal attention, why did they build the Temple Mountains? But who chose the decoration? Who chose those narratives? Who chose the topics? Of course, there was a layer of the society who was able to read, probably, or at least who knew all of these Hindu epic stories, or a selection of them. And they probably also somebody knew the other architectural or ritual books, rule books, because as I mentioned, if we just look at the architectural layout of the building, we see that it is following the Hindu Indian rules. But we don't know which rule book was followed. We don't know which language they used to design these temples. And we know even less about which version they knew, which version of the Hindu epics, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, or any other Hindu textbook, which version was known in the time of Baphuon. And so who was the person who selected the exact narrative stories and decided to position them on different parts of the building? There are so many questions about it, which are all going back to the unknown literal sources. So because of the lack of this knowledge, I am not able to answer to any of those questions, although those should be the basic questions. You mentioned the multi-layered surface of all of this knowledge, all of the reading of these reliefs, and it always goes back to the same basic question that we don't know. We really don't know which Hindu version, which Hindu text was known, used, and selected in the 11th century or even later in Angkor. And just a little addition, according to my knowledge, now we are in the 11th century, the middle of the 11th century. The Angkorian world has been already depicted Hindu epic stories for at least 100 years, if not longer. But in Bante Sray, Bante Sray didn't just happen. It must have been predecessor knowledge when they carved Bante Sray, and later on Baphuon and all of the other monuments. At the same time, in India, they did not depict a Mahabharata story, not even one. They started to depict them after the 11th century. So
that's amazing.
Which is amazing. I hope I'm right about it. That's all I learned for all of these years. Yes, there are a lot of depictions, of course, in India, much earlier ones than the Angkorian depictions about gods, about a lot of stories, but not these Mahabharata stories, which are quite often depicted, especially from the 11th century in Angkor.
Thank you. Let's get to some of these interesting questions. Speaking of intertextuality, this question by Chanratana Jen deals with this. And it's something that occurred to me as I was listening to you as well, that even though, let me read his question. So the Baphuon temple is dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva. But as Chanratana says here, but most of the stories that are shown on the walls are about the Mahabharata and the different avatars of Vishnu. So can you comment on that? And Ratana asks, do you think that this model of these presentations, in other words, these depictions of Vishnu in the Mahabharata, would have influenced the bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat 100 years later? In other words, were these temples talking to each other over this 100-year period? But what about this use of the Mahabharata at a temple dedicated to Shiva?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and I'm intending to work on this question because that's a really relevant question. And if you look back, I always bring Bante Sray to the picture because I researched that, and I'm sure that there are a lot of connections between these two monuments. Bante Sray was also dedicated to Shiva. We know it from the inscriptions in Bante Sray, and I try to even figure out which exact Shaiva sect was building Bante Sray. It comes out the Pashupata sect, but that's another story. And yet in Bante Sray also most of the stories are from the Ramayana, but on the main pediments, especially on the first enclosures, main Gopura, the first Gopura's main pediment, both sides are Shiva related pediments. So the dancing Shiva is on one side and Durga is on the other side. And there are also some main pediments or lintels which are related to Shiva. That's Bante Sray. In Baphuon, most of the pediments and lintels I recognized, most of them unfortunately are eroded, but the ones I found are, I think almost all of them are Krishna or other Vishnu avatar related. So did the Shiva depictions disappeared, or were they exchanged in a later time? Maybe even when they turned the whole concept into a Buddhist concept, or there is another reason which at this moment I don't know. That's the big question, because previously, not only in Bante Sray but on other Shiva temples, most of the stories are about other gods or semi-gods, but on the main pediments there is always Shiva or somebody who is in close relation to Shiva appears, but not in Baphuon, although I don't know who was on the pediment of the first enclosure's main gate or the sanctuary's main gate. We don't, at least I don't know it.
Is there are there inscriptions that specifically dedicate the Baphuon temple to Shiva? So is that information fairly definitive and clear? Or is there ambiguity there?
No. No, we are not sure about it. Or no, from the architectural plan, from the whole design of the Baphuon temple, we think that it is dedicated to Shiva. From other inscriptions, we are basically sure that it was dedicated to Shiva, but in Baphuon, we don't really have any sign of a Shiva
Yes.
cult.
Okay, here's another question from Elizabeth Guthrie. Hello, Elizabeth. Is there any evidence that these bas-reliefs were painted in the past? That's an interesting question because as I've seen somewhere, the central tower at Baphuon was apparently made of wood and painted as well. And the Chinese envoy that came to Angkor in the 13th century remarked about that fact, calling it, I believe, the bronze
temple. Yes. About Baphuon, that's our only information, which was written at the very end of the 13th century, and it was rewritten multiple times, of course, in the Chinese chronicles. So that information, I think that's a relevant information about Baphuon, but also we cannot really trust, especially not on the exact color, how 𝐀𝐿 mentioned it. As for the Baphuon reliefs or any other reliefs in the 11th century, according to my knowledge, there wasn't any chemical or any other scientific sorry. It's getting to be a little bit late here. Research. I was looking for the word research about any remaining dye or paint on the surface of the Baphuon reliefs or any other 11th century reliefs. In Angkor Wat, there are some well-known examples of a basic paint on the surface of the reliefs, especially on the main gallery and on the ceiling of the cruciform gallery. But according to my knowledge, and I'm not researching Angkor Wat, especially not that part, but it's not proven that basic dye which they found there, which is still visible there, is from the age of Angkor, when Angkor Wat was built. So maybe it's a later addition. So we don't know. The answer is we don't know. But if it's just my emotional according to my emotions, basically, so it's not scientific, not scholarly proven thing, but I think they could have been painted, just because if we look at the whole Hindu world, the whole Hindu decoration style, not only now but in the past, and if we are looking at the contemporary Cambodian taste, and I'm not talking about the trend or although that's also very important in my studies, but if we just look at the contemporary Buddhist sanctuaries as well as the older Buddhist sanctuaries, color has a lot of meaning. And in the Hindu world, in the Hindu art, of course, color had an extremely deep meaning system. So it is hard to imagine that they didn't use that code system when they built temples.
Thank you. Another question from an anonymous attendee regarding the Sampot 𝐀𝐿_𝐭. The attendee asks, could you speak about the Sampot 𝐀𝐿_𝐭 on males? And the question is, it doesn't look like a Sampot to me. Please share your insights, especially how is it different with the Sampot of female characters or deities? So the difference between the Sampot Chongkaban between the male and the female characters or deities in the bas-reliefs.
Yes, so maybe I can go back. So yes, it's different, definitely different. Maybe I can, oh yes, I can go back. So just try to find a better picture. So the Sampot Chongkaban, like now, this is a contemporary word, how we call this type of clothing or garments even nowadays. That's why I used that word. It looks like a short. It's a lot shorter nowadays in the contemporary traditional Khmer clothing. It is knee-length and not this short, like in the Baphuon case, or for example in Bantesra it was much longer. But it's a short. It is Sampot is always made from one single piece of fabric, quite long piece of fabric, and how they make it is that they fit it to the hips, both sides, and then since it's a long one piece of textile, the textile which doesn't cover the body, it remains in front of the body, and they pleat it into small like a fan shape, or they just turn it into a long one long ribbon like piece of textile, and then they take it and pull it between the two legs to the back and then fix it somehow at the back. Nowadays they do it, first they do it with a knot, but finally they fix it with a nice belt. So finally the attire will look like a little bit fluffy short. Sorry to say that. That is what we call Sampot Chongkaban nowadays. If you only say Sampot, and sometimes in my presentation I didn't use the whole word, Sampot is the garment, what the traditional Khmer costume considers the lower garment, which is made from one single material, one single fabric. And if the Sampot is arranged on the body as a skirt, like in the case of the women, I go back to that, that is only called Sampot, like these. So they look like a skirt. Some book, some writer calls them sarong, but that's not correct. It's not a Khmer word. Sarong is an Indonesian word, originated word. Of course, they call the same type of costume sarong, but in Cambodia, in the contemporary costume world in Cambodia, the traditional Cambodian costume is the Sampot, like on this picture, which is a skirt. However you arrange it on you, a skirt made from one piece of material. And sarong, that word is only used for those everyday skirts, the ordinary skirts, which are made from printed Indonesian material, usually from Java or Bali, but most of the time nowadays in the Cambodian markets, you can buy these nice materials, printed materials from Java. It is even printed on them, made in Indonesia. And the Cambodian women who are very, especially in the countryside, they wear those skirts, and those are called sarong. But Sampot, back to this question, Sampot is this one. And when we differentiate Sampot Chongkaban is always the one which doesn't look like a skirt, it looks like pants. And it could be worn by men and also by women, by the way, nowadays. But on the bas-reliefs, it's strictly for the male garment. The women, they always wear skirts, so just some.
Thank you. That just reminds me of a question I meant to ask you regarding the Sompat. One thing that's stood out for me in your talk was your identification of the checkered Sompat.
Yes.
I don't know if I've ever noticed that before. Is the checkered Sompat present at any of the other bas-reliefs in the other temples, or is this unique to Baphuon?
I found it first in Bantesrai.
Okay.
And I find it on other monuments in Baphuon style monuments or Korean style monuments. So in the 10th and 11th century.
Mm. So is that to say that there was a kind of a sense of fashion during the Angkor period? In other words, that the checkered Sompat was in style, so to speak, during the 11th century, but it kind of went out of style by the 12th century?
I don't believe that. I think it's more like a Hindu iconographical rule, which I am looking for years in different Hindu rule books, which could be known in Angkor. Also, it's possible that there was something. It's really hard to find a source for that, but it's possible from contemporary ethnographic researches that there was a belief against the checkered pattern in Cambodia. So it's nothing, it has nothing to do with the Indian Hindu rule books. They believed that the checkered material is somehow demonic or dark. That's also a possibility, but it's really hard to prove.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to get to this last question before we run out of time. There may be more questions now that I haven't gotten to that I see are appearing. But another anonymous attendee asks, would you consider weapons or musical instruments another visual detail that could be considered as part of the coding system that you're using?
Well, obviously, yes. I consider weapons almost attributes, maybe not in a battle scene, but yes, weapons are extremely important, especially if they are codes like attributes in the hand of the different Hindu deities. Yes, absolutely. The instruments are an interesting question because, and that's what I'm looking for and hopelessly looking for in the hand of Krishna. He should be depicted with the flute. And I never found a Krishna depiction in Angkor with the flute. Although in India you find that's almost like an attribute as a music instrument for the young Krishna. According to my recent knowledge, musical instruments appear on these bas-reliefs in the hand of musicians, accompany always to the troops. So close to the battle scenes, and I never seen any other musical instrument, I mean, in any other narrative, but it would be nice to find some.
Well, I see we've come to the end of our time here, and unfortunately, there's some questions that we still haven't gotten to. So I apologize to the people that have left questions that we haven't yet had a chance to get to, but I will ask Dr. Zava to please take a look, and if you have time, please to respond. There's several questions here by 𝐀𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐭, who's done some extensive work on the bas-reliefs similar to you, and she's said she's quoted your work in her articles as well on the bas-reliefs and the hairstyles of Krishna in particular that she's interested in. So she has some questions that are of interest. Helen Jarvis has a question wondering if the Sampot is related to the Kroma, the checkered Sampot that is. So there's various other questions that I hope you can get to when you have a chance. Bobala, but I would like to take this moment here to just thank you again. This was a very fascinating and interesting presentation. Certainly the beginning of many, many more years of work. And I think you're laying the groundwork for many people as well who are interested in the bas-reliefs and the special coding that exists within them regarding the clothing, hairstyles, and other ornamentation within the bas-reliefs. So thank you very much again for taking your time to be here with us today and sharing your knowledge and research.
Thank you very much for everything, everybody, and especially for you.
Thank you so much. And to everyone who attended, thank you for attending. We hope to see you again at the next webinar or event presented by the Center for Khmer Studies. Everyone have a good day or evening, depending on where you are. Good day.
Thank you.